We've got a great panel here today. They're just getting mic'd up at the back. Whilst we're waiting for them, and I'll invite them just to come up as and when they're ready. My name's Tom Glover. I'm a director at CBRE looking after landlords. I won't bore you about any more of my job. Needless to say, the real question for me today is there life after Brexit? Will GDPR actually help to balance the playing field, or is it going to cause people to adapt their strategies for where their sites are being located? And perhaps one of the undiscussed topics, one of the cornerstones of any data centre, the power. There's a lack of available power in locations like Slough these days. If you look at Schiphol 2000 and whenever, 21, they're potentially getting more power in there. What sort of impact does that have? At CBRE, we continue, as George just alluded to see extensive gains within the co-location marketplace. Last year was a record year, you've probably all heard it, but 150 megawatts of co-location space in the major four markets was just astounding. And this year, surprisingly, it seems to be trending in a similar type of direction. And that is a bit of a surprise. We were kind of expecting maybe a slight downturn, but we'll see where it ends up at the end of the year. Who will be the winners and losers will be one of the questions we try and get here. The cynic in me says that London is all over. People are going to scarper up sticks and get out because of Brexit and all of these other topics. The best case is that nothing actually changes. It all stays as it currently is, and London remains kind of the powerhouse in the data centre industry, for Europe at least. Or maybe there'll be a resizing of the market across the four major markets, and possibly some other winners in other locations. The Nordics are doing a phenomenally good job of attracting some big players over there, but maybe there's some other edge type of countries that might gain from all of these changes. So there's lots to talk about. Wow, where did you all come from? The panel. Let me just introduce them very briefly. We've got Adam Tamburini, just sitting second in. Adam moved to Germany with eShelt in 2008. He's a well-known individual in the industry, but is now with NTT, who are expanding in many different interesting locations. I think one of the questions I'll be trying to tease out of him is, are they actually moving in the right direction? Derek Webster, an independent advisor, works with a lot of the funds around the data center industry, helps with country search and selections engagements, and in his time has worked with governments in positioning their strategies for data centers around the world. Phil-Lawson Shanks, first time I met him was only this year, back at the DCD session in Monaco, where we had an interesting conversation. He educated me on who EdgeConnex were. What I didn't realize at the time, until recently, is that since 2013, they've built, I think within the first 18 months of operation, 23 data centers, which to me is astounding, and I believe today, 4.5 years down the line, they've got 30 data centers globally. 5 years ago, if you said EdgeConnex, everybody in this room would have said, who? Today, they're a serious player out there, and I believe we've got another 10, just happen to have another 10 coming online in the next 6 months. Patrik, Öhlund, Patrik, an extensive background in the power and utility industry and telcos. In-depth knowledge of both of these sectors, and arguably two of the most critical components of a facility in its own right. As a CEO of North Pole, he's now supporting the expansion of the data center industry, unsurprisingly, in the Nordics. And it's just, as I said earlier, a very fast-growing region. And last but by no means least, Jason, there. Career spanning over 15 years, again, a well-known individual in the industry. He now heads up as the international partner at Infinity SDC. Has worked on probably more projects of major significance in this industry than I care to count. All the hyperscalers know him, and he's consulted again with government. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce this panel. It is, I would argue, a very well-versed panel in this industry. Remember, any questions that you've got, use this Skiddo or whatever it's called. Slido, thank you. Please feel free to put those out as we're going along. But maybe as just a starter for today, I'm going to look at Phil and say, I am astounded at what you've been doing. For a start for 10, can you maybe just provide a little bit of insight into what makes a good strategy for localization of your data center facilities maybe with a European slant, without diving into the actual questions that we're going to pose a bit later.
Sure. So for us, it's all about latency. It's bringing the service as close as possible to the consumption. So a lot of it started around content for us, particularly in America. But as it's moved to peering and now cloud, and as we go into the future technologies that are coming, it's all about minimizing that latency from the handoff from whatever that service is to whatever the consumption is, whether it's a personal device, whether it's a smart device, it doesn't really matter. It's all about bringing that close. So it's about network access, low latency.
Brilliant, thanks. Adam, yeah, lots of things going on with NTT at the moment. Are you going in the right direction? Why are you coming into the UK marketplace? Is this really a right back garden to be in? And what do you see as happening in Frankfurt at the moment? You know, what impacts you on those site selections? I noticed that in Frankfurt there are various legislations there that may encumber you from a power perspective to some degree, noise levels. What do you see as the sort of key topic areas for you guys at NTT?
Okay, so two questions there. So let's start with the Frankfurt market. Frankfurt's been a very strong market over the last few years. Sadly, we're seeing that with a few other people entering the market now. I wish they'd have stayed back in the countries they were in beforehand. But that's the nature of the game. We've seen great cloud growth there. All the cloud providers have realized that you can't have a central European facility. You have to have something in country, particularly with the legislation and the attitudes of some of the nations. 80 million Germans is a big consumer group to hit, so all the big providers have come and located in region, and that's been great for Frankfurt. It's been very successful for eShelter. In terms of NTT, NTT is a very, very successful operation in the UK already. They have Giron, they have NTT, they've gone from strength to strength, sites in Hemel Hempstead, sites in Slough, and now we're going to be working with them for a new site in East London to open up a new region for Giron, eShelter and NTT to continue to sell product into the important London market. And we'll come on to how Brexit may or may not affect that.
It's good to hear that they're at least investing some money in the London marketplace. To me, that's a positive indication that maybe things aren't entirely changing as a result of these things.
I'm going to misquote Mark Twain. I think the death of Britain has been grossly exaggerated.
I like it. So moving on to data sovereignty, one of the topics. Now, my initial thought on this was when I was originally introduced as GDPR, this is sort of the common expression used at the moment around data sovereignty, is I remember the year 2000, there's a few faces in this room will and a few won't, and all the palaver and discussions that were going on around everything's going to fail and everything's going to be a problem. GDPR kind of has not the same, but a similar type of tone and underlying message to that. It is something that the European Commission has passed legislation on. It is a reality. 2018, June, as memory serves, May, sorry, is coming into force. And everybody's going to have to sort of contend and deal with this idea that the data is owned by the individual, especially within the European boundaries, but also data that leaves Europe as well. Interestingly for me, there are companies starting quietly in the background, like Datum, if you've not come across them, look them up, that are creating some interesting apps using blockchain, topical conversation, but how can blockchain be used to capture the individual's data so that they can own it and then themselves as individuals on forward sell that to the likes of Google, Facebook, Amazon and everybody else. Just an interesting slant of where maybe data protection is creating a new industry that doesn't exist today other than with some of the big players out there who data is essential to their sort of business models. The question really starts here then is what is the real implication and impact of GDPR on data centers, on localization strategies? How is it going to impact? So, Patrik, to you first of all in this question, will the new legislation actually have an impact? Or as I maybe suggest, maybe it's just another thing that everybody's got to contend with around that site selection and demand for locations. What do your thought be on that?
I think to some extent, yes. And that is because GDPR will put a restriction or limitation on storing personal data outside of the European Union. So that means that you have no guarantees, for instance, today that you will be able to store that data in the UK, for instance, due to Brexit. It's likely, but it's not 100% guaranteed. And when something is not 100%, it's an uncertainty. And in my previous job as CFO, I learned firsthand that uncertainty equals risk. And some companies might choose to accept that risk and be fine with that. Some companies might want to mitigate that risk and look for more sort of stable and secure locations within the European Union.
Do you think, I take the point about Brexit happening, and obviously then the UK being outside of that community. Do you think that it may weigh on both sides of the equation, though, where companies require data to be in the UK, to be stored there, and, as you rightly say?
Yeah. I mean, it can go both ways. And, I mean, the British government so far has said that it will sort of comply with GDPR. Mm-hmm. So, again, my take is that it's very likely that UK will also, going forward, be a country that is sort of approved by the EU Commission to store data. But it's not 100% at this point. Uncertainty, risk, yeah.
It's the old IBM adage, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You'll get any salesman touting that one, but I appreciate that. Derek, you've done a lot of work with governments as well as the data center industry as well. I mean, what do you hear your customers, people you have contact with on a daily basis, saying about this GDPR issue and data sovereignty in general?
Yeah, so when the Brexit vote came in as a leave, I think there was a knee-jerk pause and a knee-jerk stop. The uncertainty of what the future was going to be. So at that time, literally just a couple of months after the Brexit vote, I saw a web giant who was going to come to the UK, decided not to, but they increased their colo need from X to Y. So the colo guys went, we don't see any issues. We've just seen our colo get bigger. But the reality was the self-build got lost. Saw another international foreign direct investor who had made the decision to come to the UK, has now come back just. So they took that view as in the UK, we cannot come back. But what happened was, as the government went from the fog of uncertainty into the acceptance of GDPR will happen, EU state still has to accept that because we know we have to have the authority approved by Europe. That hasn't happened yet, but will comply. I think the market reach that the UK has brought that foreign direct investor back in because the Amsterdam market may have now, I think it has the most connected location in Europe now, I think is Amsterdam. London still holds the most international connectivity. So what you saw there was this pause, wait, and return. So it's not all bad news. And what the UK has, and we mustn't forget this, is that GDPR is part of the business case, and tax, talent, and telco is still part of that mix. And the UK has a lot of talent here. We may not be the speediest to market, but there is a lot of talent. And the government is just beginning to get its story straight. In fact, the government released a paper, and you'll have to excuse, I've got a note here because it's very recently. So there is a government paper, and this was only issued a couple of weeks ago. So there's a House of Commons briefing paper called N7838, and it's titled Brexit and Data Protection. So on the one hand, it gives the clarity of where GDPR is, and also highlights some of the uncertainty of data protection, which is perhaps the biggest question. So the fog is becoming clearer now.
But it's still there.
Over.
Jason, we've talked a lot about GDPR. Do you have an opinion about what's being said? Have you got anything to add or
Sure.
thoughts?
Well, I think every market has its own individual characteristics. Like we're focused here on the UK market in Infinity, but some of the operators here have operations in Ireland, some on continental Europe, and some in the Nordics. And each of those areas have different characteristics. Be they, one might have very renewable power, very cheap power. Some have a deficit of power and very expensive power. The UK, for example, has an extremely mature model of business, and it's a market that most companies want to be playing in, and play in here quite strongly in the UK. And there's an expansion, despite all the uncertainty about Brexit and GDPR and all of the issues around that. It hasn't really stopped the expansions that are happening in the UK around data center building, and particularly the US and Asian players who are coming into the UK now with strength. So over the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a big take-up of space by, obviously, US cloud hyperscalers in the UK in particular. And despite the uncertainty around Brexit, which happened only a short time ago, there may have been a small glitch or a small pause for consideration. But my conversations with them and the deals that have happened since then, it hasn't stopped them, because this is a market they want to be in. Like the Frankfurt market, they want to be in the Frankfurt market there, despite all its challenges around regulation or energy issues or whatever the issues might be. Every market has its own challenges. I mean, the Nordics play very strongly in the energy space, and that's something that they push very strongly. But it's only one feature of that particular market. In the UK, it's a very regulated country. Its planning is a little bit difficult in places. So that's where providers like ourselves come in and assist with that process. There hasn't been that many builds in the UK by hyperscale clouds. They haven't taken out hundreds of acres or large tracts of land and built their own data centers like they have in the Nordics, and like they're starting to do in Ireland in a big way. So there's room for everybody. Every market has its own characteristics, but really it's about the market at the end of the day. It's about digital assets. It's about data within that market, and of course they're all connected. But the UK market is pretty strong, and despite all the glitches, despite all it's counterintuitive, but there hasn't been any halt or any doubt really about the growth that's going on.
Good. I think, again, as an observation before we wrap this piece up on the data sovereignty topic, at least for the time being, till questions, is that the regulations and those around data protection have been abundant around Europe a long time before GDPR became a topic. It's something that's going to be run at a local government level in each country nationally, as well as by the European Union. So I think the GDPR topic isn't necessarily going to address or adjust strategies that the providers of data centers necessarily have. It's obviously something they have to consider, and probably they have to consider it more for their customers, their actual customers, as opposed to how they operate the data centers. I liked the thought that that there are lots of other issues that people have to contend with, and with that sort of thought in mind, we'll move on to Brexit. So we had a call last week, just brief half-hour sort of introduction, and I'd put together a few questions that you probably hope I had. And I'd given 3 of these guys questions on Brexit. And as soon as that topic came up, the 2 that went on the list said, I want my bloody question on Brexit, because quite clearly that is the one piece out there right now that is causing probably most fear, uncertainty and doubt, at least in my mind. It is the big topic. It's about the British exit from Europe. Whether you agree with it or not is kind of an issue that's been discussed repeatedly, and not one that we want to discuss here. It was the failing of a government, arguably. David Cameron resigned a month after he caused the British pound to fall to all-time lows. My opening statement, is this the end and doom and gloom for the data center industry in the UK? Beyond that, though, I'm kind of really keen to get the insights from these guys around how Brexit is addressing or impacting your thoughts and strategies. So, again, just picking up with Jason again, if I can, and then we'll move around to the other 4 of you. What is and has been that impact of Brexit on Infinity's sort of strategy?
Well, you mentioned yourself, the falling pound has actually had a positive effect, because there's more spending power for US multinationals coming into the UK. So despite the local issues, it's actually helped. There's more bang for their buck. Energy is cheaper relatively now, and space. The Brexit thing is an assault as well. The other jurisdictions around Europe are using it as a big stick to beat the UK market quite considerably. They've formed strategies around how do they, compete against the UK in a stronger way because of the Brexit issues that are arising. But I think the UK has to really think a bit like the way Ireland does in terms of having a very strong message. You know, it has a very good centralised FDI policy, very clear. It uses its network in the States very well, and it's got a very clear message. The Nordics have a clear message. The UK is a little bit ambiguous at the moment. It seems to be this uncertainty and lack of clarity is certainly clouding it a bit. Hasn't affected business in terms of the take-up, but there's a lot of other jurisdictions that are using it strongly against the UK, forming policies and trying to win business from the UK on the back of it. It hasn't really worked yet, but the UK has to be very careful around this and assert its strength, assert its defensive view on this, and start really fighting back despite all the naysayers in other areas.
Okay. Phil, now the question that I wrote out for Phil was probably a bit too long when I reconsidered what I put down here. But I am fascinated. You know, you deal with some of the major hyperscalers at EdgeConnex. What are they saying to you about this whole Brexit topic? You're continuing with the expansions in Frankfurt. You're doing business in the UK, Amsterdam and Dublin. You know, you've obviously got a good purview of the European data center industry. Are you concerned about the UK market? Are you concerned about the Frankfurt market? What are your company concerns around Brexit and its implications?
Sure. Well, we have a different model. We never build speculatively, so we build where the anchor tenant wants to build, and it's very specific to their network requirements and all the other, the power requirements and all of that. So there was a pause, but now there's much more interest, and there's a realization, trying to get ahead of what we're hearing about GDPR and all these other things about data sovereignty. There's now almost a doubling down of effort to think for the UK market, as more and more workflows are working to the cloud providers have to have those engines here in this region. So there's a tremendous amount of interest, and not only around the London area, which is it's a harder market to build into just because of the geography, and it's hard to trench new fiber around the city. Slough has a lot of power. There's quite a lot of saturation there. But again, we're seeing that a lot of these providers don't want to just be around those major zones. As we've seen in other regions, they like to own their own destiny, and there's a lot more view of moving further out and looking for greenfield sites or renovating new buildings in the other regions like Manchester and Edinburgh and other parts of the country.
I mean, Edge is part of the name, and what is the Edge is a whole conversation we can probably have an hour discussion about as well. I fully understand and can see just by evidence, that the major markets, some of those secondary tier 2 type of markets, the Manchesters, the Birminghams of the UK, being of interest. But outside of what we call the flap, and let's just call it the UK, Germany, Paris, and the Netherlands as countries, are there any areas outside of that Edge are looking to get to the edge of?
Oh, yes, absolutely. As more workflows move to these engines, latency is becoming tremendously important, and it'll just be exponentially greater when 5G gets ratified. That'll change an awful lot. So there's a rush, not a rush, but there's an effort in place to get ahead of that and place infrastructure that can be used by these larger hyperscalers and then build their ecosystems around that to service the businesses as close as possible to metros that typically have had to trench or had to pull their data from the flat regions and trombone it back. So peering has to be local, content has to be local, cloud, access. And before we even start talking about things like mixed reality and virtual reality, which is going to just grow it even more.
Yeah, and IoT, I mean,
Exactly.
You're going to have to get closer to those devices to make it a real experience for the end user, ultimately.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Patrik, is it Patrik next? Yes, it is. So, what's your perspective on the issue of Brexit? And secondly, are the Nordics kicking the UK's ass and winning business that maybe the UK should have been winning?
Well, on the second one, yes, of course. No, seriously speaking, I mean, Brexit will not sort of empty UK and the data center market in the UK will just close down. That's not going to happen, of course. I think it will be alive and happy also going forward. I think what is more sort of realistic is that it will have a certain impact on certain industries, meaning that, for instance, some of the operations related to the finance industry likely to move to Frankfurt and so on, but there can also be new business opportunities in the UK because of the Brexit. So I think you will see changes, both good and bad from a UK perspective. And also I think it comes back to what I said before about uncertainty. Again, uncertainty equals risk, and some companies might choose to do something about that risk and look elsewhere than the UK for their operations, just because of the uncertainty, while others might have the reason that they have other reasons to be in the UK and they choose to accept the risk of uncertainty. So I think to summarize, Brexit will cause some movement, but it's not going to sort of just destroy the market.
Yeah. And it's an interesting juxtaposition. You've got risk on one side of the equation, which we all understand in this industry, but also on the other side of the equation is, Phil, you were saying, you've got to get to those customers as well, and there's a balancing act that needs to be performed there to ultimately make sure that the customer gets what they want. It's an interesting conversation here. Derek, foreign investment community view. Take us through events that you've seen since the Brexit decision around investment into this sector.
Yes, I mean, just a comment on the latency issue and the locations of loads. So the location of where the load can shift. So there are certainly some nations who are looking at the UK saying, expand outside the UK with your lower latency need. Maybe you'll back up your cloud. And there's software there that can strip the personal identifiers out, process outside the UK, bring that data back, reconnect the ID, so the personal information doesn't actually leave the UK, but the processing can. So there are some nations that are looking for UK enterprises to expand outside the UK. So you would say the UK is under stress of that pressure, because with the lower latency need, you can provide a lower cost base. And this is, I think, going to test the server hugger era of the server hugger wanting their data in place. I think it will put stress on the UK, where the server hugger hold, the business case, starts to get slightly weaker if you're talking about bulk backup, bulk data. And I think we've even seen some, if you take the German market, we're even seeing German companies processing their load outside of Germany. So I think you're beginning to see that little shift. So I think that Brexit uncertainty just adds that little extra wedge to, you could process outside the UK, you could process out the German market for the lower latency. I think with 4K and photos and videos where latency is important, you're absolutely in the right place, sit on top of the networks, great. But you have to remember also, the UK has a lot of global connectivity, from London to Hong Kong in a single strand. So there's very few locations that has that international reach, and that's quite important also. But I don't think there's any question during this period of uncertainty, the UK is under stress, and foreign direct investors are taking a slightly different view too, because the location can save you money, and what the UK has going for it is a low tax base. And when you look at total cost, then the Brexit argument is, can we put up with Brexit because the UK's total cost tax base is still quite competitive. But if you're looking at those foreign direct investors who want speed to a market, lots of power, and a short planning or permit time, the UK does struggle there. So I think when you get to the more cloud-based clients, the UK is at a disadvantage there.
Yeah, I mean, the UK, from our perspective, is the biggest market in Europe for data centers. That said, I'm not convinced there's been necessarily that much assistance, planned assistance, from government to make that the case. It's kind of been the case because there's great connectivity coming in. We are connected, as you say, from east to west. And the sort of the power constraints haven't existed here. We've got a strong infrastructure, there's good rule of law. So those things are there to support it, the industry, and that's kind of supported over the last 10, 15 years, this industry to where it is today. It's a very young fledgling industry. But that's kind of not, in my mind at least, and this is not a CBRE statement, this is just my opinion here, it's not due to government incentives. Now, I look at the Nordics, and I quote the Nordics, not Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway. I call you one in this case. I think as a consortium of countries, they've done a phenomenally good job at attracting data centers with a very clear proposition as well. It's not the same proposition that the UK, Frankfurt, Germany has got. It's a very different proposition, but they've done a great job. But I digress slightly.
Yeah. If I can add to that also, we are recently, in the last 6 to 12 months or so, we're actually coming together as one. So we are working together between the Nordic countries to fine-tune and also sharpen the value proposition. So I think you're right.
Yeah.
We are quite clear on our strengths.
You've had the support of the government as well, governments.
Absolutely, yeah.
Adam, so back to you.
Yep, couldn't agree more. What you've seen with the Nordics is you've really punched above your weight in terms of attracting the data center industry there. When you look at the UK, that's not been the case, but that's because the UK has been the £800 gorilla in the data center market across Europe. And when you're already the gorilla, you don't need to punch above your weight. I think Brexit is going to put a strain. I think it's not quite as bad as people saw. So in the first few months post-Brexit, there was a big reaction. There was a lot of things put on hold. A lot of people paused and tried to see how it was going to play out. 4 or 5 months later, they realized, okay, it's going to take many years to play out. There was the delay until the notice was served. There's then the 2-year period. They're already talking about that period going into transitional period. That transitional period is likely to be extended. We are not in an industry which can wait for 4 years to see what's going to happen. So I think a lot of companies from that initial pause from a few months and now realize they're having to make decisions. There are still 60, 65 million consumers in the UK. There is still, as we sit here today, a strong banking sector. You only need to look out the window at the tower cranes, which are still going up across London. So, as I said earlier, I think reports of Britain's demise have been grossly exaggerated.
I like that one. That's Brexit done. I'm just going to say questions, start using, give me the name again.
Slido.
Slido? Slido, got it, okay. Please, if you've got questions, we will have a Q&A after this next topic. So energy. It's the last of the 3 components of this discussion. Energy is an interesting one. It is the cornerstone of any data center location. If you don't have energy and you look at the cost of trying to draw it in, recent as this week, I was asked, we've got a plot of land, £15 million, it's this big, we want to put a data center there. My next question to the guy was, how much is it going to cost to draw power in? And the answer was £45 million. So very quickly in that particular case, the conversation went sideways, and quite frankly, unless EdgeConnex is interested, it's not worth taking any further. Sales pitch done. But in all seriousness, power is one of the cornerstones of this localization strategies. We are seeing in Schiphol a lack of power, and that's arguably one of the hubs in Amsterdam for data centers. 2021 is when the next set of power is due to come online there, and if you don't have power there today pre-allocated, you're not going to get it. In Slough, we have seen Equinix, Xenium, Vertus and others drawing on what was an abundance of power, which now, again, what we're hearing, and I stand to be correct on this, is that it can be as long as 18 months out before you can get new power into Slough. So there is this sort of binding thought to me that there is a struggling issue around power, and it is critical. Ireland, Apple, delighted with the result of being able to build their own power station, I think, but it took a lot of effort. To the panel, Patrik, I'm going to go with first. Just talking about power, especially the Nordics, what is that balancing act between power and latency and availability and cost? I mean, how do you discuss that topic with your clients? And what are the constraints that power brings to sites?
Yeah, I think it is exactly as you said, it's a balancing act. And I think, Jason, you put it very well before that each and every market have their different strengths and weaknesses, of course. And I think it's very clear to everybody, has been said already, that the Nordics can offer almost unlimited scalability in terms of power access. And it's also sustainable in terms of low carbon footprint and so on. And I think that second part is not discussed as much as it needed, in my opinion. Some of you might have children, and I don't think you can look them in the eye and say that carbon emissions do not matter. We don't care about it. I think we as an industry have a responsibility to do things wisely. So that being said, again, I think it's a balancing act in that enterprises and co-location companies need to figure out a smart way. It's a challenge, and at the same time, I think it's an opportunity to figure out how can I sort of balance the workload between different locations. How can I balance the computing power, whether it's something that needs to be close to the customers at the very sort of forefront of the market, or whether it's sort of back-end HPC calculations. And the hyperscalers that we have talked about before, they have already this figured out. So I mean, they're using your services being very close to the market, and they have their sort of hyperscale back offices in the Nordics, and of course in other locations as well. So I think going forward, when you sort of encounter the limitations in access to power, and it might also have a huge carbon footprint, then you could consider, okay, so can I shift maybe some of this workload maybe to the Nordics, and then free up some space in those premium locations, and then sort of bring more customers into those locations and increase your ROI. So I think it's not as simple as we should just move everything to the Nordics or everything to the edge. It is about...
We can move to the edge, that's okay.
Yeah, but you will not have the power.
Oh, we'll talk about that.
so it's and it's dirty also.
Well, we'll talk about that.
No, but again, it's a balancing act, and I think the companies that can optimize this and be smart about it, how they optimize between different locations, can both be close to the customers and scale unlimited and grow with green power in a good combination.
Thank you. Adam, Germany, you've got a couple of sites there, you shelter, bit of space on the side to grow into. Government legislation, I believe, in Frankfurt is changing around
on thermal loads,
the noise levels
yep.
that generators, backup generators can generate. And I count generation power, the generation of power as a component of energy, obviously. It's essential in this sector. How is that kind of influencing eShelter's view? I mean, are you going to stay in Frankfurt? Are you going to move out to the edges of Germany? I heard recently, as much as Frankfurt is the hub, only about 19% of the data that goes in remains in Frankfurt. Yep. A lot more of it actually goes out to Hamburg, to Dusseldorf, to the other major cities in Germany. So what is your view of the impact of power legislation, and what's it going to do to your strategy there? So
the situation with power in Germany has changed. 10 years ago, when I explained to them how it worked in the UK, that I'd pay a power authority £50,000, and then 6 to 9 months later, they may or may not come back to me with a quote, which would be how much money I had to give them to then allow me to buy power from them, they used to laugh. They thought that was crazy. The big decision you had to make when you asked for a power quote in Germany was whether you wanted to hold on the phone or have the guy phone you back in 5 minutes with what was available. That's not quite the situation anymore. So now they have a lot of challenges, the same as we have. Energy onto the grid is a lot more difficult, particularly the Frankfurt area with the amount of activity which has been around there. We have a 120 megawatt site, we have a 90 megawatt site, and we're about to now break ground on another 90 megawatt site in Frankfurt. So as far as we're concerned, Frankfurt is still the place to be. But we also have a 30 megawatt site in Berlin. We have a 30 megawatt site in Munich. I think to the earlier conversation, yes, historically Germany has been very, very Frankfurt dominated for the data center industry, but the rest of industry in Germany is incredibly spaced out, be it insurance in Munich or government and education out of Berlin. And to the whole edge concepts now, I think the data center industry is starting to follow that. So we have another 4 or 5 cities across Germany and are likely to add more. We've recently opened in Bonn. So I think it's going to be both. So it's going to be continued expansion in Frankfurt and continued expansion across the secondary cities.
Do you have a view on this government legislation topic around noise levels?
It's noise and thermal load is the other thing, in particularly in Frankfurt, they're very interested in. And there are ways, like all of these things, where you can mitigate that. So you can either actually sign up for the legislation where you become a power generator as far as the government is concerned, and then you can go for the larger sites, or there's ways of splitting your site into multiple campuses effect, where you then don't hit some of the regulations. From our point of view, it's all good news. Anything which makes the build challenging demonstrates the value of going to a good provider like ourselves.
Thanks, Adam. Derek, I'll posture that finding sites is a difficult job. Finding good sites is even harder, and finding great sites these days, especially in the London market, is nigh on impossible. Mm-hmm. And power is part of that equation that I am seeing as one of those constraints making that task more and more difficult. What options are there for people's strategy around localization to adopt, considering power's constraint that is occurring in certain locations?
So the UK, which is a London-centric market, it's difficult to find 20 to 40 meg, quickly. The Nordics, if you want 100 meg, if you want 400 meg.
Yeah, not very difficult.
Yes, it's and very, very fast. So there are a number of schemes that the UK is looking at, which is on-site power gas, so the lesser of an evil. Also waste incineration plants, a number of them scattered around the M2025, specifically focusing on data center use. So those are initiatives, although not perfect, helping to try and address that future growth. But it's not just the power too, it's what's happening in the boardroom too, and the carbon cost. So when you follow the carbon process, the UK doesn't sit well in terms of fossil fuels use and its carbon load. So the boardroom's now becoming very much into how can I send my statement out, and now green policy means we've got less X number of carbon tons. So the location is absolutely key. And I come back to this latency issue too. There's the latency of where you have to be, and then there's the latency issues of where you don't have to be. So in defense of the UK a little bit too, there's a lot of ex-industrial cities that have the capacity embedded that are not used, as the decline of the manufacturing industry in the UK is sort of shown. And I think Arc is a really good example of that. Sort of 100 miles outside of London. It's gaining quite a bit of share. You've got the site in South Wales. So there are a number of 100 meg sites, but they've taken 10 years to position themselves. Yeah. So it's not impossible. I do also see if GDPR hits and you've got a foreign direct investor. There's a company I'm working with now who are saying we don't need to be in London because our bulk storage and analytics could be somewhere else, but we need that international connectivity back to Asia, which is coming. Right. So there are already some clients who are looking at the Asian market coming to Europe, but also how do you get from Asia to US? And the UK has this geographical sweet spot where if you mapped all the planned fibres, planned, the UK is really this sort of link between Asia, US, to Asia, Europe, US, if all those investments come ahead. Now that forces you then to look outside the southeast, but I don't think our government helps too in getting those foreign direct investors in. So power's important. We are slow. I think differently. And plus, doesn't the UK have Europe's largest offshore wind farm? So we're helping to supplement, but it's not a perfect, quick answer.
Okay.
Was that kind of a ragged defence of the UK? Yeah.
Well, I
try my best.
I think the UK needs to start earlier. I like the £800 gorilla statement. I think you're right, but that can create apathy as well.
Yep.
You sort of the silverback in the room plodding along, and you've got these other guys, Tykes, Nordics, biting at your heels, taking some of your business, and there's nothing wrong with competition. And I do think that there needs to be a little bit more thought maybe into a data centre strategy for the community at large around the UK, and I include Scotland and Wales in that sort of statement. It'd be nice to see some time and effort put into that in the same way that the Nordics have done a great job themselves, but they did it 6-7 years earlier. Okay, so they're the three topics that we wanted to cover off, but I'm going to just ask if it's okay, just looking at the time, two of the panel, if you can. I think it's going to be you, Jason, and Phil at the other end, just to summarise in a sentence, maybe two, your key give to this audience, what you're taking away around these three areas. Who wants to go first?
Well, just on the energy thing, you could have a whole conference around energy and data. It is really the biggest topic. It's the biggest untalked about issue. It's a massive issue. It's in the back of all the discussions around data center locations. I mean, certainly the Nordics have a fantastic abundance of renewable, relatively cheaper energy. They also have a very good distribution system. So it's not just about your location, it's about the generation of power, which could be 1,000 miles away or a couple of 100 miles away, and the transmission or the distribution to get to that location. So in places like Dublin, a market that I'm very familiar with, they have really a distribution issue more than a generation issue, because it's getting the transformers and the high capacity lines to certain locations can take years, can take 4 or 5 years of planning and tens of millions of euros. And it's also in parallel with the types of data that people are managing. So if you look at Iceland, they have relatively cheap power, but also they have a lot of Bitcoin now. So Bitcoin needs very low energy because that's the fundamental cost of generating Bitcoin. And they don't want any UPSs, they don't need any gensets. They just want to generate the damn Bitcoin and make some money. And they're doing it very well. And you'll see that cascade down to the other Nordic countries, like Sweden will pick up Bitcoin business now as it becomes more valuable and as it becomes more legitimate as a cryptocurrency and more acceptable. So that's a different type of data. And also, if you think about hot data, warm data and cold data, like glacial data, that can be stored anywhere with cheap power, and it's only going to be a fraction of a cent then per gigabyte of data then, to store that on a monthly or a yearly basis. So, but the energy issue is the fundamental issue. There is no bigger issue, actually, ultimately, because that is the business that we're in. We're in the business of energy, fundamentally. And it hasn't been really addressed by the IT giants, the users of our data centers, and they're building their own data centers as well, more and more. And it's going to become a bigger topic. Even the whole revolution around free cooling or fresh air cooling, where you're exhausting all that heat out into the atmosphere. I mean, that just has to. It isn't sustainable long term. It's not a model that has to end up in a district heating scheme or in a biosphere or something like that. You just can't waste kilowatt after kilowatt for every kilowatt of energy you're using on one side of the data center, that you just kind of let it out the window. I mean, how sustainable is that really? And that is categorized as a good use of, because you're not using electrical chillers, but fundamentally it's a very flawed model. So there's lots of discussion there. I think, despite GDPR and Brexit, energy to me is the key issue.
Okay, that's good feedback. More than 2 sentences, but it was useful.
All right, 2 sentences.
Phil, 2 sentences.
Sure. So I think fundamentally we've got to realize that the workflows are changing. The technology is changing that's driving a lot of these engines. We used to design data centers for 3 to 5 to 7 kilowatts a cabinet. Now typically we're designing them to be 20, 30, 40 kilowatts a cabinet. So the load is growing exponentially, which has obviously a knock-on effect to the supply. So we built a site recently in Dublin, and we secured the power, but the anchor actually wanted that power for their own site. So we sold it to them, and we ended up using natural gas generators, which has been a huge boon for us. It's actually cheaper to do gas than it is to buy electrons, so it's great. And we've pre-allocated the power, so when it comes back in, when they get the new transformers and new routes, we will have the choice. But for us, everything's about power. We've pre-bought all the power in Amsterdam. It's just something that we have to do. So we can talk about location. It's not only where the network has to be served best, but it's also finding that power that gives us the runway to where our customers need to go. And that power is so much more than it used to be.
I like the last point you make there, that you actually created effectively your own power station to give yourself power. And that in America is not an uncommon approach to building data centers.
No, not at all.
It's very uncommon in Europe, but it's good to hear that as a last touch.
And it was a Scottish company we used as well.
Oh, not a problem, it's part of the UK. How do I get questions? Do I just press? Does that bring up questions? No. Oh, hang on. Right, we'll take a couple of very quick questions because we are running out of time. Electric vehicles en masse are coming soon. 2.6 million London cars, 10 gigawatts of power required daily. Will data...
I might have a point on that, just on the electric cars, because electric cars need batteries. And batteries, the battery technology is very evolutionary. It's early days. And there's going to be a need for battery farms in every country, in every area. And that will be a big competitor for the grid and for transmission and for infrastructure going forward. And it could actually be a better model for some FDI countries to develop battery farms and battery factories than data centers. It's coming. There's nothing's happening about it at the moment in any significant way, but I think that could be a big competitor to the data center industry going forward.
If I can add to that, I think it's both competition and cooperation will be forced, because you cannot the cars will not be charged evenly across the day. It will be different times of day and night and so on. So then I think we need to be smarter about the power load of the data centers to the extent possible, given SLAs and so on. So if you can sort of adjust the power load and sort of match that with the electrical cars, then we're being smart about it.
But data centers run 24/7, so they need power 24/7. A home can benefit from that because you don't use energy at night, but you could use the battery during the day. But a data center is a 24/7 cycle, and it's going to be a challenge.
It's a challenge, for sure.
Also, too, if you look at the data that cars will give, and the storage of that data also means you're adding to the DC market space, the data center market space. So I think you're going to see a lot of growth in the back-end storage of petabytes and zettabytes. I think Google said 5 terabytes per car per day.
Wow.
Storage and data processing.
I'm going to, because of time, just jump in a little bit. Adam, the next question, I actually like this one. If you could just give a view on this from a data center operator. So given the legal responsibilities in GDPR on data processors, are data center operators charging their lawyers to draw up tight indemnity policies, or are they just ignoring it because we're not responsible for the data, it's the guys that are using our facilities?
Thanks for that one, Tom.
Sorry, mate.
And I think it's the second point.
It's a great question.
This is always a battle we have with customers in terms of whose the data is. The customer's data is the customer's data. We don't control it, we can't see it, we can't interact with it. It does get a little bit more complicated when we start getting involved with combined transmission, and even if you just have some out-of-band connection for a customer. But ultimately, we can't influence, we can't see it. So in terms of the GDPR, it'll be a little bit like the SOC regulations and various other ones. We will be part of our customers complying with the regulation, but we're not going to be the principal person because we don't own the data in the first place.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I've been hearing myself over the last few years. So, ladies and gentlemen, We're going to draw that to a conclusion. I am sorry for those of you that gave questions that we haven't answered. They were good questions, and I don't like to miss over them. My summary is that there was probably as many questions that have been provided as answers from this panel, but I do sincerely appreciate every one of yours time and contribution. My summary is that the UK is under pressure right now. I don't think it's going to be catastrophic. I think personally things are going to balance out, probably net equal at the end of the day. But there is that fear and uncertainty and doubt, and that will continue to create debate and discussion around these topics, individually or combined. I think that we will see a swing, or I'm hoping that we're going to start seeing in the UK marketplace from a strategy point of view, that London is very congested. The north, the south, out to Slough on the west side, there are data centre operators now. The one bit that I'm looking forward to seeing is what happens to the east of London, where, quite frankly, there's nothing at the moment, but there is space and power. So as those marketplaces in the UK get busier, maybe we'll move over to the west. We'll see. I do think the Nordics are going to continue winning some big business. I think that there's a very specific niche that they're playing in, but it's a good niche to be in. The question there really is, how will the operators benefit? And I think on-off ramps will be one of those places, again, to Phil's point earlier on, that's been sort of re-emphasised by others, getting closer to the customer, whether it's through IoT devices, the car, your mobile phone. If the customer end user experience is poor, then that's going to be a problem. Again, thank you. I hope you all found it useful and interesting. Yeah, we're all here around. If you want to grab one of us by the shoulder, I'm sure we'll be more than happy to talk at some other point. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.